Mr. Charles St. Laurent will states that Mrs. Sarah Montgomery will inherit all his landed property.
The will states that the pharmaceutical company will be under his control, and his money and funds will be wired into the name of Sarah. Every car's under his name band, every business will be passed unto Sarah Montgomery. These are the contents of the will. Mr. Charles St. Laurent has stated who will take his properties.
There is a particular kind of loneliness that money cannot fix. Not the loneliness of empty rooms or quiet evenings. Those can be filled, rearranged, decorated into something that resembles company. The loneliness that money cannot fix is the kind that lives in a house full of people who are waiting for you to die. The kind that sits across from you at dinner and checks its phone and calculates, behind its pleasant expression, exactly how much longer it has to perform concern before the performance becomes unnecessary. Charles St. Laurent had been living inside that loneliness for 3 years. He just had not named it yet. The St. Laurent estate sat on 4 acres of landscaped property on the western edge of Raleigh, North Carolina, behind a wrought iron gate that had been installed in 1987 when Charles St. Laurent was 42 years old, and his textile manufacturing company had just crossed its first $100 million in annual revenue. The gate had seemed appropriate then, a statement of arrival, of having built something substantial enough to protect. 40 years later, the gate was still there, still imposing, still swinging open with the same hydraulic precision. Everything behind it had changed. Charles was 81 years old. He had built St. Laurent Textile Group from a single mill in Burlington into a manufacturing operation that employed 11,000 people across 6 states at its peak. He had done this with the specific ruthless patience of a man who understood that building something real required decades of decisions that looked wrong in the short term and proved themselves in the long one. He had been right about most of them. The company had been sold to a private equity firm 12 years ago for $900 million. Charles had kept the estate, the investments, the art collection, and the particular satisfaction of a man who has done the thing he set out to do. What Charles had not kept was the version of his family that had existed before the sale. Claudia St. Laurent was 63 years old and had been Charles's wife for 38 years. She was the kind of beautiful that required maintenance and received it, regular appointments, careful presentation, the organized discipline of a woman who understood that her position in certain rooms depended on how she looked walking into them. She had given Charles 2 sons of Preston, 36, who lived in Charlotte and ran a consulting firm that Charles had quietly funded 3 times without being asked for repayment, and Garrett, 34, who lived in Asheville and had not held a job that lasted more than 18 months since he graduated from Wake Forest 9 years ago. Both sons called on birthdays and holidays with the specific brief warmth of people performing obligation rather than feeling it. Charles's health had begun its decline 3 years ago. A mild stroke in the spring, followed by a cardiac event in the fall, followed by the slow accumulation of the smaller indignities that accompany a body in its 80s. The knee that required a cane, the vision that required new glasses every 6 months, the memory that sometimes stuttered on names it had known for decades. None of it was catastrophic. All of it was manageable with proper medical attention and the specific daily support of people who were paying attention. Claudia was not paying attention. She was paying attention to other things, which will be addressed in time. Preston called once a month and asked how Charles was feeling, listened to the answer for approximately 90 seconds, and redirected the conversation to whatever he needed from his father that month. Garrett did not call at all unless Claudia reminded him, and sometimes not even then. The estate's household staff had been reduced over the past 3 years, first the gardening crew, then the cook, then the housekeeper, each reduction initiated by Claudia with the justification of economy and the actual motivation of reducing the number of people in the house who might notice things and mention them to someone. By the spring of the year this story takes place. The estate that had once employed 12 full-time household staff employed 2. a part-time driver named Walt who came on Tuesdays and Fridays, and a woman named Iris who cleaned on Mondays and whose thoroughness had been declining in direct proportion to how little anyone checked her work. Charles spent most of his days in the study on the ground floor, the room where he had always worked, where the desk faced the window that faced the garden, where the shelves held 40 years of industry publications and business biographies, and the specific accumulated reading of a man who had always believed that understanding the world was the precondition for operating effectively in it. He still read. He still thought clearly. He was not a man whose mind had gone. His mind was precisely where it had always been. It was his body that was failing, and his body was failing faster than it needed to because the doctor's appointments that should have been happening monthly were happening, at Claudia's management of the schedule, quarterly, and sometimes not even that. The house across the road, not a grand house, a 3-bedroom craftsman with a covered porch and a yard that had seen better decades, had been empty for 8 months when Sarah Montgomery moved in with her daughter Ellis on the first Saturday of April. Charles saw them from the study window. A woman in her late 40s, he estimated, with the specific physical competence of someone accustomed to doing things herself, carrying boxes from the rental truck, with the efficient economy of movement that comes from not having anyone to wait for. Beside her, a younger woman, early 20s, dark-skinned like her mother, taller, with her hair pulled back and her sleeves rolled up, and the same efficient economy of movement. They worked for 6 hours without stopping. By the time the rental truck pulled away, the covered porch had 2 chairs on it and a small potted plant by the door. Charles watched all of this from his study window. Then he went back to his book. Sarah Montgomery was 49 years old and had moved to Raleigh from Greensboro for a job at a logistics company on the south side of the city, a position that paid 31% more than the job she had left, and that she had applied for 17 times over 2 years before they called her back. She was a woman who applied for things 17 times. This was useful information about her character. Ellis Montgomery was 23, her mother's daughter in the ways that matter, the competence, the directness, the specific refusal to perform helplessness when helplessness was inconvenient. She was working toward a nursing certification at Wake Tech Community College and picking up shifts at a pharmacy on Glenwood Avenue 3 evenings a week. She had her mother's efficiency and her own particular warmth, the kind that made strangers feel immediately that they had been seen rather than processed. They had been in the house for 4 days when Ellis noticed the old man. She was on the porch with her morning coffee, 6:45 a.m., watching the quiet street come to life, when she saw him at the window of the estate across the road. Not clearly, just the outline of him, standing at the study window looking out. He was there for perhaps 2 minutes, then gone. She noticed it the way she noticed most things, completely, without making a particular decision to pay attention. The second time she noticed him was 3 days later, on a Thursday afternoon, when she was weeding the front yard and looked up to see him standing on the estate's front steps with a cane, looking at the garden beds that ran along the inside of the iron fence. The garden beds that had clearly once been maintained with care and were now overgrown with the specific abandonment of things that had been forgotten rather than surrendered. Ellis stood up, brushed the soil from her knees, and walked to the fence. "Those were roses," she said, nodding at the bed nearest the gate. "You can still see the canes underneath." Charles looked at her. 81 years old, silver-haired, wearing a cardigan that had probably been expensive and was now slightly too large for the body it was on. His eyes were sharp. "Margaret planted those," he said. "My first wife 30 years ago, Ellis. We just moved in across the road. I know, I watched you move in." He said it without apology, the directness of a man whose age had eliminated the social requirement to pretend he had not been paying attention. "Charles sent Lauren. Do you want them cleared out, the overgrowth?" He looked at the beds. Something moved across his face, not quite grief, something older than grief. "Nobody tends them anymore." "Could," Ellis said, "if you wanted." Charles looked at her for a moment. Then he said, "I would want that," and went back inside. Ellis told her mother about the exchange that evening over dinner, and Sarah listened with the specific attentiveness she brought to information about people, absorbing it fully, filing it, connecting it to what she had already observed. She had observed the estate across the road the way Ellis had its size, its condition, the gap between what it had clearly once been and what it currently was. She had also observed that in 4 days she had seen no one enter or leave except an older gentleman on Tuesdays and Fridays in a black sedan, and a woman on Mondays with cleaning supplies. She had not seen the wife Ellis mentioned until the following Saturday, when a silver Mercedes pulled through the gate mid-morning, and Claudia St. Laurent got out wearing sunglasses and an expression of someone who had somewhere better to be, and was briefly inconvenienced by needing to be here first. Sarah watched Claudia walk into the house, watched the front door close, watched the Mercedes sit in the drive for 40 minutes before Claudia came back out and left again. Then Sarah crossed the road, rang the bell, and introduced herself. Charles answered the door himself, which told her something. He looked at Sarah with the same sharp eyes Ellis had described, assessing, direct, unimpressed by surfaces. "You're the mother," he said. "Sarah Montgomery, your neighbor." He opened the door wider. "Come in." The inside of the estate was the inside of a house where someone had stopped caring. Not dirty, the Monday cleaning maintained a surface level of order, but the specific neglect of a house that had stopped being a home. Curtains slightly askew, dust on the upper shelves, a smell of closed rooms. The kitchen, visible from the entrance hall, had the feel of a room that was used minimally and cleaned perfunctorily. Sarah sat in the study across from Charles's desk, and they talked for an hour. Charles talked about the mill, about Burlington, about the years when the company was growing, and the decisions he had made, and the ones he wished he had made differently. Sarah talked about Greensboro, about the logistics job, about Ellis and the nursing program. Neither of them talked about Claudia or about the condition of the house, or about the thing that was visible to Sarah from the moment she walked in, which was that this man was not well and was not being looked after. When she stood to leave, Charles said, "You didn't ask me about my family," Sarah said. "Most people do when they come in and see the house like this." "I figured you'd tell me what you wanted me to know." Charles looked at her. Then he said, "My wife is having an affair with my friend Gerald Marsh, has been for about 2 years. My sons are waiting for me to die so they can divide the estate. My doctor's appointments have been reduced to quarterly because Claudia manages my calendar and finds them inconvenient." He said all of this in the flat, direct voice of a man reporting facts that had ceased to have the power to wound him and had become simply the landscape he was living in. "I have a knee that needs attention, a heart that needs monitoring, and nobody in this house who is paying attention to either." Sarah looked at him steadily. "I'll be back tomorrow morning," she said. "I'll bring breakfast." She brought breakfast, and then she came back the next day, and the day after that. Ellis cleared the rose beds on Saturday morning, 4 hours, methodical, the overgrowth pulled back to reveal the canes underneath that were older than she was and still viable. Charles watched from the study window, then came out and stood by the fence and directed her on the pruning, demonstrating with his hands the angle the shears should follow. And Ellis followed his direction with the attentiveness of someone who understood that being taught something by someone who knows it is a privilege. The rhythm established itself the way rhythms do between people who have recognized something useful in each other. Sarah came in the mornings before work, an hour, sometimes less, making sure Charles had eaten, making sure his medications were taken in the correct order at the correct time, making sure the windows were open and the curtains were pulled back so the study got the morning light it was supposed to get. Ellis came in the afternoons when her schedule allowed, working in the garden, sitting with Charles in the study, listening to him talk about the mill and the company and the 40 years of decisions that had built something real. Claudia noticed. Of course she did. She appeared in the study doorway one Tuesday morning when Sarah was there and looked at the two of them, Charles at his desk, Sarah in the chair across from it with a cup of coffee, with an expression that moved rapidly from surprise to calculation. "How nice," Claudia said in the voice of a woman performing pleasantness over something that was not pleasant. "Charles has made friends. Sarah Montgomery," Sarah said, standing and extending her hand. "We're across the road," Claudia shook it briefly, looked at Charles. I didn't know you were having visitors, darling. You didn't ask, Charles said. Claudia's smile held. I'll have to have you both for dinner sometime. She would not have them for dinner. She left the room and her perfume stayed after her. That evening Sarah heard Charles on the phone from the hallway, his voice low and even, the voice of a man saying something he had decided to say. I want to see Dr. Abernathy, he said. This week. Make the appointment, Walt. I'll handle Claudia, doctor. Abernathy's appointment revealed what the quarterly scheduling had been preventing from being revealed. A knee that required immediate orthopedic attention, a cardiac rhythm irregularity that should have been caught 6 months earlier, and a blood pressure reading that Dr. Abernathy described, in the careful language of a physician trying not to alarm his patient while communicating urgency, as requiring immediate adjustment of medication. He referred Charles to a cardiologist. He referred Charles to an orthopedic specialist. He documented everything. Charles told Sarah about the appointment that Thursday morning, reading from the referral paperwork with the specific fluency of a man who had spent 40 years reading documents and knew how to extract what mattered. Sarah listened, asked 2 precise questions, and the following morning arrived with a notebook in which she had written the names and numbers of the specialists, their earliest available appointments, and a medication schedule that cross-referenced Dr. Abernathy's instructions against what Charles was currently taking. She had done this the previous evening after Ellis, who was 3 months from her nursing certification, had reviewed the referral paperwork and identified 3 things that needed to be tracked. You didn't have to do all this, Charles said. I know, Sarah said, and opened his calendar. Claudia's response to the medical appointments was the response of a woman whose plan was being disrupted without her permission. A series of small obstructions, each individually deniable, collectively clear. She rescheduled the cardiologist appointment without telling Charles. She told Walt that Charles was not to be driven to medical appointments without her explicit authorization. She had a conversation with Preston that Charles was not supposed to hear and that he heard anyway, standing in the hallway outside the sitting room in which Claudia said, He's got these women from across the road involved in everything now. It's becoming a problem, Preston said. How much of a problem? Claudia said. Enough that you and your brother should probably come up here. Charles walked back to his study and sat at his desk and looked at the garden through the window, the rose beds cleared and pruned, the canes visible and orderly, the first new growth beginning at the tips. Then he picked up his phone and called his attorney. Gerald Marsh had been Charles's friend for 26 years. They had met at an industry conference in Charlotte in the late 90s, found in each other the specific compatibility of men who had built things and could talk about the building without performance or pretense, and maintained the friendship through the subsequent decades with the irregular but genuine contact of men whose respect for each other did not require constant maintenance. Charles had known about Gerald and Claudia for longer than he had told Sarah. He had known for 2 years and 8 months, since the evening he had come downstairs at 2 a.m. unable to sleep and found Claudia's phone on the kitchen counter and seen, in the moment before the screen locked, enough to understand the nature of what he was looking at. He had said nothing. He had gone back upstairs. He had sat with it in the specific way of a man who has spent 80 years learning that the timing of when you move on information matters as much as the information itself. The timing had arrived. Gerald came to the estate on a Thursday afternoon in July, invited for lunch by Claudia, who did not know that Charles had asked Walt to be present, or that Charles's attorney Howard Briggs had driven up from downtown Raleigh that morning and was sitting in the study when Gerald arrived. Gerald walked into the sitting room expecting Claudia and found Charles. The calculation on Gerald's face in that moment, the rapid assessment of what was known and what was not, was the calculation of a man who had been keeping a secret for 2 years and 8 months and was suddenly uncertain of the ground beneath him. Sit down, Gerald, Charles said. Gerald sat. Charles spoke for 11 minutes. He did not raise his voice. He did not use words that were imprecise or excessive. He said what was true in the order that it was true, in the voice he had used in 40 years of difficult business conversations, the voice of a man who has done his preparation and is now simply reporting the results of it. When he finished, Gerald sat in the sitting room with the expression of a man who had been expecting a performance and received instead a verdict. "Friendship is finished," Charles said. "That's all I wanted you to know in person." Gerald left. Claudia, who had been in the garden and came in through the back door at the moment Gerald's car was leaving through the front gate, stopped in the kitchen doorway and looked at Charles standing in the hall. She understood what had happened in the specific instant way of a woman who has been calculating her position for 2 years and has just seen the calculation change. "Charles," she began. "Howard is in the study," Charles said. "He has some paperwork for you." Preston and Garrett arrived the following weekend. They came together, a fact that told Charles they had coordinated, which told him they had been coordinating for longer than this particular weekend. Preston was tall, well-dressed, with the confident affect of a man who had been the more capable son for so long that capability had become a performance rather than a practice. Garrett was quieter, softer, with the slightly unfocused quality of a man who had never been required to be specific about what he wanted from his life, and had therefore never developed the musculature of wanting things specifically. They sat in the sitting room with Charles and spoke for 2 hours in the careful language of adult children performing concern for a parent whose assets they were simultaneously considering. They mentioned the neighbors. They mentioned it carefully, with the framing of concern for their father's privacy, for the estate's security, for the appropriate boundaries between Charles and people they did not know. Preston said, "We just want to make sure you're not being taken advantage of, Dad." Charles looked at his eldest son. "When is the last time you called to ask how I was doing?" Preston said. "I call every month." "You call every month and ask how I'm feeling for 90 seconds and then tell me about whatever you need." "That's not calling to ask how I'm doing. That's calling to maintain the appearance of calling." He looked at Garrett. "When did you last call?" Garrett looked at the floor. "Women across the road," Charles said, "have done more for me in 4 months than this family has done in 3 years. Sarah ensures I take my medications correctly, made my medical appointments when your mother was preventing them, and has sat with me in this house when this house was empty in every way that matters. Ellis cleared the rose beds your grandmother planted. She pruned them correctly and they are growing." He paused. "I don't know what I'm being taken advantage of, but I know what being abandoned looks like. I've been looking at it for 3 years. Preston opened his mouth. Charles held up one hand. "Howard has reviewed the estate documents. Everything is in order. You're both welcome to stay for dinner if you'd like." He stood, took his cane, and walked back to the study. Neither of them stayed for dinner. The months that followed were the best months Charles had experienced in 3 years. The cardiologist adjusted his medication, and the rhythm irregularity stabilized. The orthopedic specialist fitted him for a brace that made the cane less necessary and the daily walk around the garden possible again. Sarah arrived each morning with the specific, reliable warmth of someone who was there because she wanted to be there. And Ellis came in the afternoons and sat with him in the study while he talked. And she listened and occasionally asked questions that were more precise than questions from someone 3 months from a nursing certification had any right to be. He told them about the mill, about Burlington in the 60s when he had started, the machines, the workers, the specific smell of the production floor that he could still locate in his memory 40 years later. He told them about Margaret, his first wife, who had planted the roses and died of cancer when Charles was 54, and whose absence he had managed with the same methodical patience he brought to everything, which was not the same as healing but was what he had. He told them about Claudia, the early years, when the marriage had been real, when he had believed in it with the same conviction he brought to his business decisions, and the long, slow process by which it had become something else, something that required performance to maintain. Sarah listened to all of it. She did not perform sympathy or produce easy comfort. She listened the way she did everything, completely, without deciding in advance what she thought. Sometimes she said things that were precise and true and arrived at the exact angle that made the thing he had been carrying easier to carry. Sometimes she said nothing. Both were useful. Ellis, for her part, had begun bringing her coursework to the study in the afternoons, spreading her nursing texts across the secondary desk in the corner while Charles read at the main desk, the two of them working in the specific comfortable silence of people who have stopped needing to fill the space between them with performance. Charles occasionally looked over at her materials, asked questions, offered observations from his own decades of reading that connected to what she was studying in ways that surprised her and delighted him. "You should have been a doctor," she told him once. "I should have been many things," he said. "I was a manufacturer. It was enough." Claudia had moved to a downtown apartment following the conversation with Howard and the paperwork that followed. She had not contested anything. Howard had been thorough, and the documentation was complete. She had taken the Merceds and the jewelry and the specific wounded dignity of a woman who had been caught, and was performing the version of the ending that preserved the most surface. Preston called twice after her departure, both times to discuss the estate's management going forward. Charles told him the estate was being managed satisfactorily and ended both calls inside 3 minutes. Charles St. Laurent died on a Tuesday morning in October, in the study, in the chair behind the desk that faced the window that faced the garden. He had been declining for 6 weeks, not suddenly, not dramatically. The specific measured withdrawal of a body that has decided it is finished, and is proceeding toward that conclusion with the same deliberate patience that had characterized everything Charles had ever done. Dr. Abernathy had been honest with him about the timeline. Charles had received the honesty with the equanimity of a man who has had 81 years to make his peace with the fact that everything ends. Sarah had been with him that morning. She had arrived at 7, made coffee, sat across from him while he read for an hour. Ellis had come at 9 with her coursework. At 10:43, Charles put his book down on the desk, looked out the window at the garden, the rose beds, the new growth on the old canes, the October light on the iron fence, and said, "Margaret would have liked you both." Those were his last words. He closed his eyes and did not open them again. Sarah called Dr. Abernathy, and then she called Howard Briggs, and then she held Ellis's hand in the study while they waited, and the October morning continued outside the window with the specific indifference of mornings that do not know what has happened inside the rooms they illuminate. The call to Preston was made by Howard. Preston called Garrett. They arrived the following day with the specific performance of grief that people produce when they have not earned the real thing, the dark clothing, the careful expressions, the language of loss that sounds correct without resonating. They move through the estate with the assessing energy of men who have been waiting for this moment, and are now conducting the inventory they have been conducting in their heads for years. Howard asked them to be present at the reading of the will on Friday. Howard Briggs read the will in the study on a Friday afternoon, with Preston and Garrett on one side of the room and Sarah and Ellis on the other. Claudia had been notified but did not attend, which was, in Howard's experience, the decision of a woman who had already calculated that her presence would cost more than her absence. The will was thorough, as everything Charles had ever done was thorough. It had been updated 8 months ago, 4 months after Sarah and Ellis moved in across the road, Howard noted, without elaboration. The provisions for Preston and Garrett were not nothing. Each received a cash settlement that Howard described as substantial, and that represented a genuine acknowledgement of paternity rather than the reward of proximity. There were bequests to 3 charities connected to the textile industry in North Carolina, a fund for the Burlington Mill Workers' Pension, and a specific directive about the rose beds that made Ellis press her hand to her mouth. Then Howard read the primary bequest. The estate, the 4 acres, the house, the contents, the art collection passed in full to Sarah and Ellis Montgomery. The investment portfolio, after the cash settlements and charitable bequests, passed in full to Sarah and Ellis Montgomery. The total value of what passed to them, Howard said, was not a number he would read aloud in the room but that he would discuss with them privately, and that it was substantial. Preston stood up. "This is not," he began and stopped, because there was no sentence he could finish that would not confirm everything his father had said to him in the sitting room 4 months ago. Garrett said nothing. He looked at the window, at the garden, at the rose beds. Howard waited for the room to settle, then continued reading. At the end of the document, after the formal provisions, was a handwritten addendum in Charles's specific, precise script that Howard read aloud as instructed. It said, "To Sarah and Ellis, you came across the road. You didn't have to, you stayed. You didn't have to do that either. Margaret would have liked you both. The roses are yours, take care of them." Room was quiet for a moment. Sarah looked at Ellis. Ellis looked at her mother. Neither of them spoke. Outside the study window, the October light moved across the garden in the specific late afternoon way of October light in North Carolina, warm and exact and already aware that it is running out. Now before we go, ask yourself this. If you had been Preston or Garrett, would you have done anything differently? Would you have called more, visited more, been present for the man who built the life that built yours? And what does it say about us, about all of us, that it took two strangers from across the road to do what a family could not? Charles sent. Lauren died with more dignity than most men manage. Not because of his money, because of the two women who came across the road and stayed. Think about the people in your life who are sitting in empty houses, the ones whose phone doesn't ring, the ones whose garden has gone to overgrowth because nobody tends it anymore. They are not asking for much. They are asking for what Sarah and Ellis gave: presence, attention, the simple revolutionary act of showing up. That is all. That is everything. Thank you for watching. Thank you for staying with this story all the way to the end. It means more than you know. Stay with us for the next one, because what is coming will stay with you even longer.